Hello Popcorn Junkies, welcome to this review of what many would describe as quite a niche, tiny art house film. It comes from A24 and although it's niche and although it's low budgeted and although it hasn't got a major release and you might not hear a lot about it, there's not going to be much chatter, there aren't going to be many people going to see it. They should, because actually this is quite a clever, nifty, moving and funny little film that parks itself within the hashtag Me Too sort of realm of films, if you like. There's a new film coming out from Luca Guadagnino, I think starring Julia Roberts, and I think it got quite a rapturous reception at the Venice Film Festival, and I think that's about something similar. Essentially, sexual abuse and exploitation of kind of, occupying a senior position in academia or education. I think that speaks to the topic of when is someone being sexually abused, taken advantage of, when is someone actually being exploited in the sort of academic space by someone, a professor, a teacher, someone of seniority who should know better. So this film is called Sorry Baby. It's directed and stars someone called Eva Victor. Now, they're an actor, they're a writer, they star in it, they wrote it, and they directed it. It also stars Naomi Ackie as their friend, and probably the only other notable name in there that you'd recognise is Lucas Hedges, who also plays a very hapless bloke. And as I say, it's a story, it's a very gentle film, it's a very low-key film. You're not coming to this film for swooping camera footage and elaborate sequences. I mean, shots are held for long durational pauses, and it starts with a bunch of kind of friends all having dinner, drinks together. They're back referencing and talking about their time, their experience at college, and how successful they all have or haven't been. But then quite slowly what evolves is the story of Agnes's sexual abuse at the hands of her professor. As I say, it's a very gentle film, it's a very low-key film, it's very sort of intimately written, it's funny. I mean, I think Eva Victor is also a stand-up comedian. And so what happens is they all have this dinner, they all have this meal, you get a sense of sort of rivalries. The dialogue is quite it's quite theatrical, it's quite stage-like, and at first it took a little bit of getting used to just how sort of potentially pretentious they all sounded. But by about 15-20 minutes in, this film enacted quite a curious charm on me, and much of that needs to be laid at the feet of Eva Victor as Agnes. But anyway, where this film gets really interesting, unfortunately, pivots around the fact that something awful has happened to Agnes. In the flashbacks, we discover and we're introduced to Agnes's class, her classmates, the teacher that she's very sort of, she idolizes. I thought the professor, played by, Louis Cancelmi, was very, very good. They were sort of shifty. I come across it with sort of academics, he was shifty. He was kind of impressed by her intellect when he was kind of giving her feedback on her essays. You could tell he was bullshitting and he was looking to kind of create a situation or a kind of honey trap or bear trap in which he could spend time with her in some way. And Agnes was, Eva Victor's character, was very good at not seeing that, not believing that would happen. There is a conversation between her and her flatmate, Naomi Ackie, at some point when they talk about, but if he wanted to have sex with you, would you have sex with him, and all that kind of stuff. So it's kind of earmarked that something's going to happen. And then we have this incredibly difficult scene where Agnes goes to the professor's house. Agnes goes in, you see it's light, and then you see it go down, and then it fades through an exterior of the sort of shutterboard house. It fades through to evening, and then it fades through to really late at night. And she doesn't come running out in an obvious fashion. She comes out, she's disorientated, she's she's tying up her laces, or her shoes are undone. She goes to her car, she drives home, and she's in a daze. And where I think this film is actually really clever and would really relate, unfortunately, to a huge number of women who have experienced any form of sexual impropriety or abuse, or men have overstepped the mark. I think where this film is really interesting is, yes, there's the moment of trauma. It doesn't hover over it. We don't see it, but in inferring it, it does that most powerful of things where you're left with essentially Agnes's testimony of what happened as she describes it to Naomi Ackie, her friend, back at their digs. And you see the shock, you see the paralysis, you see an emotional paralysis in her, and you see a sort of slow dawning realization of what was allowed to happen. And in the describing of what happens, which is deeply uncomfortable to listen to actually, you also get a real sense of how the professor, Preston Decker, persistence in trying to kind of assault her, but how persistent he was. It was clearly an attempt to take advantage of her. The whole narrative, the literal narrative, gets complicated in that the day after this has happened, the professor resigns, she goes to the authorities, they can't do anything because he's now no longer under their jurisdiction because he's left. She goes to the police and she's met with that sort of sense of, didn't you report it? Why didn't you report it? And when you do report it, how can they prove anything? And then the college can't punish him because actually he's moved. So the unanswerability, the inability to kind of enact any justice or acknowledgement is really underlined in this. There's a very powerful scene where she's called up for potential jury service, and in the process of them selecting people who could be appropriate for jury service, I think one of the lines they ask them is, has anyone experienced a crime that could in some way compromise their ability to be an effective juror? She reveals that she is the victim of a crime, but doesn't want to reveal what the crime is because she says it would leave her feeling vulnerable, and the person in question wasn't prosecuted for it. And I just thought it was a really interesting moment where Agnes, the character, managed to say this wasn't about her wanting the punishment of the guy, but she kind of wanted an acknowledgement that it had happened, and I hear that a lot. But what I thought was fundamentally really clever about this, and a real shout out has to go out to Eva Victor for their performance in this film. This proved that the aftermath of sexual assault or someone, raping you or attacking you isn't just about obvious trauma. This film speaks to the less obvious aspects of post-traumatic stress from something like this. Yes, erratic behavior. She goes and gets a cat. She brings a cat home. She adopts it. She also, has a fling with Lucas Hedges, who's a student or a guy who lives in one of the houses nearer to her. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of detail to have, that she was having a functional, if you like, sexual relationship with a younger man in the aftermath of this awful experience with her professor. It really made those scenes of intimacy between a man and a woman weighted. They felt weighted insofar as I found it really curious and difficult to watch Lucas Hedges, just a normal young guy having a sexual relationship with Agnes, when we knew what she'd gone through. And I remember years ago having a relationship with someone who themselves had unfortunately experienced an awful sexual attack, and the tenderness with which one needs to step around that, but also when you don't necessarily need to be tender, because a victim of these things doesn't just always want to be a victim. And I thought this film was really clever and really nifty and interesting in the apparent contradictions of how someone would process the experience of being sexually abused. I know, sometimes it's said, Grief can manifest itself in very different ways for different people. Some people can go on a complete bender, other people can go very dark and isolated, some can appear to be like having the time of their lives, but actually it's their way of processing the trauma. And what I think was really interesting about this film was it threw up some alternate ways or routes or portrayals of a woman processing trauma, and it allowed us actually, and going back to this idea of how awkward it was to see her sexually involved with another man after the event, it encouraged us as viewers to think about, next time you're just doing something quite ordinary, like Lucas Hedges taking his clothes off and getting in the bath, bear in mind that for the person you're doing that with, this could be this could have all sorts of other ramifications and potential triggers and thoughts and issues around it. There's a very powerful scene where Lucas Hedges is getting into the bath with her at one point. It's a romantic scene. They get on. There's nothing suspicious about Lucas Hedges. He's just an ordinary guy. He's a bit annoyingly ordinary, like he'll just lift the toilet lid up and go for a piss in the toilet whilst she's in the bath right near her head. It's just like, I've never understood this going to the toilet in front of each other thing. I've never got that. But there is a moment where he's kind of stripping down and he's a bit embarrassed about her seeing his flaccid, as he said, it doesn't look too big. And she made this really interesting point. Agnes, the character, who's in the bath waiting for him to join her. And she's had this abusive experience. She's kind of processing it in a sort of very restrained way. And she's looking at it. She says, just stand there, I just want to look at it. And she says, isn't that interesting how men get really kind of caught? Aren't men weird? Aren't men silly that they get caught up about the size of it? She said, I much prefer it when it's small. And I just thought there was something really fascinating in terms of feminist politics there. That men get obsessed and worried about size and girth and how does it look when it's not erect and all this kind of stuff. Whereas for women, well, certainly for Agnes in this film, I'm not saying for all women, it was not necessarily, size and erection is not the be-all and end-all of everything. In fact, quite the opposite. And I thought it was quite an interesting reversal of what she was looking for in a sexual partner. There was even a scene of sex between her and Lucas Hedges, which was not nice to watch, and it was functional, and he was a classic bloke where you just thought, oh my God, you're not thinking of her at all here. But he wasn't doing anything wrong overtly. But again, going back to this idea of because we knew what she'd gone through, these scenes had a certain heaviness to them and a certain complication to them. And again, Eva Victor just held this trauma in such a believable fashion that you felt it sort of filtering into everything else. It sounds depressing. It wasn't. It was kind of done with a lightness of touch. It was really authentic and real. As I say, it really encourages you to think about the ordinary parts of a victim of sexual assault's life after the sexual assault, rather than always just seeing them as darkly destroyed and broken. She's not broken, she's damaged. I think one of the tragedies within it is that because it's her professor, and I think this is something that happens a lot in education, because the professor has kind of connected or fused his respect for her intelligence into the way in which he then ensnares her, if you like, and gets her into his house and then abuses her. What does thread through the film is her own self-doubt around not only her intellect and her intelligence, but also her self-worth and who she is and what she is. And that's the horror that, this is a film less interested in the obvious horror of sexual assault, the literalness of what he did, that he raped her, that he attacked her. But it's about all of those kind of really, they're not smaller details, they're hugely significant details, but the ways in which that awful act spills into and seeps into all of the tiniest elements of everyday life, whether it be looking at your friend becoming a mum, holding a baby, looking at your boyfriend's penis when it's flaccid whilst he's just saying, oh, I'm sorry, it doesn't look too big, having sex, feeling alone. It's a totally wrong-footing portrait of the aftermath and the effects of trauma on, in this instance, on a young woman at college. But I just think it's a really, and it never loses a sort of gallows sense of humour, a sort of wry, self-deprecatory tone. It doesn't take itself too seriously. There are a couple of beats where perhaps the characters were a bit literal. She has a jealous friend who's wanted the job, and she's kind of, driven and riven and serious, and she says that she actually slept with the professor willingly, which in itself triggers Agnes into a bit of a traumatic sort of spiral. There's a really nice intimate scene where she pulls up into a car park and offloads with a guy who runs the sandwich shop. I mean, again, how believable was that? But I thought it was a really poignant moment of connection where he gives her validation and he says, what you've gone through is serious. What you've gone through is horrible. But it's also a film that shows how victims of sexual trauma or traumatic experiences at the hands of men do go on living, can have a sense of humour, and do function. But the edges are knocked off. If I was to score this film, I would give this 80 out of 100.